Thanks, Leah, for that wonderful introduction. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. This is joint work with my friend and colleague, Jason Houle, who is currently an assistant professor of sociology at Dartmouth College. It is pretty well known that student loan debt is high and rising. So according to the Federal Reserve Bank, as of 2017, aggregate student loan debt has surpassed $1.5 trillion, has passed auto and credit card debt, and is second only to mortgage debt on the household balance sheet. Compared with other forms of consumer debt, this trend is quite unique. If you look at the rise in student loan, it continued to rise even through the Great Recession when other forms of non-mortgage consumer debt were on the decline. Not only do we see more young adults taking on debt to attend college, so this here shows the percent of students who borrowed, we also see that that graduates are leaving college with increasing amounts of average debt. So as of 2017, the average undergraduate borrower leaves college with approximately $37,000 in debt. This has led some to argue that there may not necessarily be a student loan crisis, but really a student debt repayment crisis, given that about 40% of outstanding federal education loan debt was held by about 9% of borrowers, owing more than $80,000. So as you can see in this chart, about 56% of the borrowers held less than $20,000, while 6% had about at least $100,000, right? So we see this bifurcation in the distribution of how student loan debt is distributed. Whereas the U.S. Department of Education reports that more than 8 million federal loan borrowers are in default and have not made a payment in at least a year. In addition, close to 3 million federal direct loan program borrowers are more than 30 days delinquent. We would argue that it may not necessarily be a question of either or, but really for what populations may it be both. What we know is that more students are going to college and are taking on loans to do so. And over the past 30 years, college costs have risen faster than inflation, and state and federal aid per student has failed to keep pace. Students and their families have had to foot the bill, turning to loans to make up the difference between family resources and the rising costs of college. Policymakers, stakeholders, and scholars express concern about these rising levels of student debt in the United States. They ask questions such as, will young adults be able to repay it? Is it impacting behavior in the mortgage market, in the labor market, in the relationship market? So some of my earlier work looked at the relationship between education debt and credit card debt on transitions into cohabitation and marriage in young adulthood. They are also asking questions about whether it's worth the investment or the risk. These are questions that I'm going to revisit towards the end of my talk. When Jason and I began this work, relatively few studies explored the disproportionate role of student debt among Black students. So here you can see Black students here are more likely to have loans and also have higher levels of student debt. This has changed. On June 18th, 2018, a letter was sent to the current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. The letter had a very clear agenda. It says, the federal student loan program disproportionately impacted students of color, and the current structure and actions of the department have failed to protect these borrowers. The letter was signed by 60 members of the Senate and House combined, all Democrats representing 29 different states. Of the 21 senators who signed, 6 have already announced that they're running in the 2020 election, and an additional person is likely to announce soon. And in early 2019, Senators Kamala Harris, Doug Jones, Catherine Mastro, and Elizabeth Warren put out a call for stakeholder input on how to address racial disparities in student debt. The issue of student debt and the disproportionate burden faced by students of color pursuing post-secondary education has reached policymakers, is a central talking point by the media, and is on the radar of those who have decided to challenge the current president's bid for re-election. So in this project that I'm presenting today, We believe that racial disparities in debt are large and increase across the early adult life course, and that racial disparities in student debt is contributing to Black-white wealth inequality among a recent cohort of college-attending young adults. We argue that racial disparities in debt, accrual, and repayment reflect processes of racialized economic hardship and discrimination that accumulate across the life course for recent cohorts of young adults, specifically that both existing and historical processes of racial discrimination and racial stratification and exclusion compound across the life course to create inequalities in debt and debt burden. What we do is pinpoint 3 specific domains to explain how debt disparities exist prior to school enrollment, persist during the post-secondary schooling years, and factors upon school leaving that contribute to this ongoing divergence in debt repayment. Our first domain is family social background and the legacy of disadvantage. So parents' social and economic resources are key determinants of their adult children's college success, as parents often use their finances and knowledge resources to help their children navigate post-secondary institutions, contributing money to college expenses and take on debt in lieu of their children. The upshot is that children, or that young adults from more socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds by wealth, income, and education, leave college with less debt than their counterparts who are from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. So here is some work that Jason has done that looked at the relationship between student debt and parental education, and we see the slight negative relationship as parental education increased, the amount of student loans that young adults had by age 25 declined. You can also look at the relationship between income and student loan debt, and here we see that at the lower ends of the income distribution, those students had accumulated a little less, which is not too surprising because those would be the students that have access to grant aid, such as Pell Grants. But then we see those in the middle of the income distribution taking on more debt, and then those coming from households with higher income are taking on a little less debt. So in earlier work, we explored the relationship between family wealth and student loan debt accumulation. Family wealth is particularly important research that drives racial disparities in debt because federal financial aid decisions are primarily based on income rather than wealth. And so what we found is that in the aggregate, the relationship was negative, right? So as parental wealth increased, the amount of debt that young adults had acquired by age 25 was also declined. However, when we disaggregated this by race, for white youth, we found that this relationship held, this negative relationship between parental wealth and debt. However, for Black youth, at the most basic level, wealth was not associated with the amount of debt that their children accumulated. So in our data, white parents on average contributed about $12,000 over the course of their college career, whereas Black parents contributed about $4,200, so $12,000 over the course compared to $4,200 that Black parents were able to contribute. One of the things that we point out is that the wealth distributions are so incredibly disparate that Black parents only compose about 3.2% of the top wealth quintile, which was defined in our sample as holding at least $191,000. These families have substantially less home equity and only half the financial assets of whites at similar points in the distribution. What we argue or believe is that Black parents may have, at the high ends of the Black wealth distribution, may be less able to transfer wealth to their children than their white counterparts, perhaps in part due to having fewer liquid assets such as stocks, bonds, and savings, which can be passed down a little bit more easily to the next generation. Our second domain is post-secondary institutional characteristics. So here, Black young adults are often funneled towards predatory for-profit institutions or are more likely to attend underfunded schools, which are associated with high levels of debt accumulation. So here, this is from a report that was put out by the United Negro College Fund that showed that Black young adults who attended historically Black colleges and institutions were more likely to take on federal loans, and the amount borrowed was higher. So the Orange are the attendees of the four-year HBCUs, and the yellows are those who did not attend a four-year HBCU. According to Pew, in 2015, about 9% of Black students enrolled in HBCU institutions, and they graduated about 15% of all bachelor's degrees that were earned by Black students. What the United Negro College Fund report also showed was that the historically Black college with the highest endowment, which is currently Howard University, located in Washington, D.C., has an endowment of about $600 million. You can compare that with the non-HBCU institutions. For example, the University of Michigan is number 10, and their endowment is $9.5 billion. Okay, so these are vastly different amounts of endowments in which these universities are able to help support their students that are enrolling in these institutions. This chart here shows the relationship between for-profit enrollment. So in 2011 and 2012, Black students made up about 16% of the undergraduate population. But if you look at both either two-year or four-year institutions, they were disproportionately represented. So 26% in the two-year and 27% in the four-year. Included in the post-secondary institutional characteristics is the idea that they may also have unequal access to credit markets. So what we're saying here is that Black youth are more likely to have or take on private loans which carry high and variable interest rates, have high fees for deferment and forbearance, and they are less likely to have the same protections as federal loans, such as income-based repayment options and the negligible chance that they could actually have the loans discharged in bankruptcy. So the loans that they're taking on are more costlier, right? So we see across the population the rise in undergraduate students taking on private loans to fund their education. But as you can see here in the second bars, Black youth are more likely or have higher percentage of receiving these loans during the period. So if we scrutinize the data a little bit more, the rise in private loans actually increased during the Great Recession. And that was across the board. Our third and final domain that we explore is post-college labor market success and the fragility of the Black middle class, which I'll explain a bit more in a second. So as young adults, Black youth experience hardship and discrimination in the labor market that makes debt more burdensome to repay. So some experimental research has shown that even among college graduates, Black youth are less likely to obtain job offers and receive offers for much lower paying jobs or positions with fewer options for career advancement than their white colleagues. More broadly, these Black-white disparities in earnings, employment, and wealth are observable in young adulthood. And due to the precarious economic position, Black youth may have more difficulty paying back their debt at the same rate as the white youth. So here this is some information showing rates of unemployment over time. So the bottom light blue line is for all college graduates, and we see across from 1980 to 2013, Black college graduates consistently had higher rates of unemployment. And the bottom disaggregates it by, again, looking at graduates, looking at rates of underemployment. So underemployment being defined as young adults who had a college degree but held jobs that either did not require a degree or had less or required less than a college degree. And so Black college graduates here are that dark blue line at the top. You consistently see them being employed in these underemployed positions. So this connects to what I was just saying about why we may suspect that they may have higher rates of higher default rates or seriously delinquent rates. Again, this is the Black right here. You can see a 33% of serious delinquency and close to 20% of high default rates. So taken together, these racialized life course processes accumulate over time to lead Black youth to shoulder a disproportionate more debt that is harder to repay than their white counterparts. So more recently, some scholars, Seamster and Sharon Chenier, have argued that racial disparities in student debt are a form of predatory inclusion for youth of color. That is, over the past several decades, Black youth have gained access or greater access to post-secondary institutions, but have made these gains on exploitative terms that have thrust Black youth deeper into the red. So our main arguments are, as I outlined earlier, racial disparities in debt are large and increase across the early adult life course, and that these disparities may have long-term consequences for racial inequalities in wealth and the fragility of the next generation of the Black middle class. I'm going to start here with part one, the first argument, and then transition to the second argument. So our data, in order to address these arguments, comes from the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, the 1997 cohort. So this is a nationally representative survey of close to 9,000 youth who were born between 1980 and 1984. They were first interviewed in 1997. They were interviewed annually between 1997 and 2011, interviewed again in 2013, and again in 2015. We restrict our respondents to anyone who ever enrolled in a post-secondary institution, so baseline is going to start when they first enrolled. And our final sample for the results that I'm presenting today consists of about 3,600 respondents and about 31,000 person years. So our student loan variable is going to be a total student loan value from all sources, so government loans, private, and family and friends, so anything that they designated as a loan. And then we have in our model controls for our separate buckets from our different domains. So the first one being social, that social and family background bucket, which includes the self-identified race of the respondent, their sex, their age and years, their parents' SES status, so including all the income, net wealth, and their educational attainment. Number of siblings in the household, and their family structure, so whether or not they lived with both biological parents when they were age 14. In that second domain, we have information from the sample on the degrees that they pursued and attained, the current enrollment status, the number of enrollment spells that they had over the course of our study period. We also have information on the price of the institutions that they attended, the amount of financial generosity of those particular institutions, and whether or not the institution was a for-profit institution. And for that last piece on young adult social and economic roles, we include information on their marital status, whether or not they're living with their parents, whether or not they have any children, their current employment status, their wages, if they are current homeowners, any values of all financial assets, and any other unsecured debt that does not include student loans. So in order to address our first argument, so again, this is the question that we're looking at, how do racial disparities in debt change across the early adult life course? We use hierarchical linear growth curve models in order to estimate the relationship between student loan debt and race. We use So this model allows us at the first level to explore within person trajectories of student loan debt as a linear function of time, and at the second level, between person differences in both the baseline, so the intercept, and the trajectory of student loan, or the slope of student debt. So this framework is going to allow us to examine several things, both racial disparities of student debt at baseline, so when we first see them enter into our study period, how trajectories of student debt vary over time as a function of race, and thirdly, the extent to which racial disparities in debt trajectories are explained by our three domains, so our family background characteristics, our post-secondary institutional characteristics, and young adult socioeconomic status. So we do this final step by interacting the slope of debt by our characteristics across those domains by race. So here's the results from Model 1. We just include all the controls at the intercept level. And at the very top, we see here, when we exponentiate the coefficient, that blacks, so this is the baseline intercept, blacks hold approximately about 55% more debt than whites, right? When we scroll down and look at the slope change over time on the black coefficient, we see that it's positive. And when we exponentiate that, it shows that the black-white debt disparity is increasing by about 7.2% annually. That is how we interpret this, that black youth are starting their young adult careers, or in our sample, with more debt, and this disparity is growing over time. Here, which is the coefficient on our time variable, which can also be translated as the payback rate for the whites in our sample, we see that it's negative, right? So the payback rate on student debt is actually declining for them over the period by about 3%. So this is just a projection. If we believe that the whites in our sample started with about $10,000 on average, we see the baseline difference here for blacks starting at about $15,480 and then projected out over 15 years, although we see the rates look like they are actually getting closer. In absolute terms, the difference between the two values is actually higher at the end of the 15 years, or at the end of the projection. So then what we do is, as I said, we're going to look at how the paydown rate changes as we account for the inequalities in our different domains. So the family background, the post-secondary institutional characteristics, and the young adult characteristics. So Model 2 is going to include those interactive terms with race, including family background. In Model 3, we're going to add in those post-secondary institutional characteristics, and then in Model 4, we're going to account for all of them, like all of the inequalities in all of our three domains, right? And what we find is that actually, to the extent that we can explain the pay down rate or the repayment rate, we are able to explain about 50% of it. So it goes from about, as you can see, the coefficient went from 0.07 to about 0.035. We see the largest decline with the addition of these young adult characteristics. So let me see if I can highlight this. I don't want to make you too dizzy, but that area right there, we see when we add in those young adult characteristics, the decline in the pay down rate drops the largest. And we also find that the inclusion of these young adult characteristics is explaining a large part. So what we argue here is that we believe that white youth are entering into employment with better pay and are able to start repaying their debts sooner and at larger amounts, right? So in the full model, which I can show if you have interest later on, we're really finding that wages, whether or not they live with parents, financial assets, and not having a child, are really driving that decline in the payback rate. We also find that family background characteristics are explaining the differences, are largely driving the differences in debt at baseline, but only play a small role in explaining the growth in the disparity over the period. Okay, so those are all four models. And this is a projection of the repayment rates over, again, my 15-year period, comparing Model 1. So the light orange is showing if we don't account for those inequalities across those three domains, and then how much we're able to explain once we do account for those inequalities in Model 4. So this is the red line at the bottom. So now we're going to shift a little bit and talk about race, debt, and the wealth gap. In particular, here we are arguing that student debt may be this new mechanism by which racial, social, and economic inequalities are produced and may be reproduced across generations. So here I'm answering that question. Do racial disparities in debt contribute to racial disparities in wealth in young adulthood? So why am I interested in wealth? I do work on wealth. I've been doing it for several years. I have an interest in wealth because wealth in the United States has helped to establish and maintain a system of racial status and hierarchy, racial hierarchy. The lack of wealth, be it withheld or stolen, and debt accumulation have positioned blacks at the bottom of the wealth distribution across generations. So whereas sociologists and a growing number of economists have been examining racial wealth differences for quite some time, there has been an increasing interest in racial wealth inequality since the Great Recession, when all households experienced wealth losses, but Black and Latino households were less able to recoup their losses compared with white households. So this is just taken from a report that was published by Pew, and you see here, if you can, that after around the Great Recession, we see a widening of the racial wealth gap, but it continued to increase, largely in part due to Black households, the amount of wealth in their households on average declining, and a slight uptick in the average amount of wealth held by white households. And this is the same as repeated across for Latino households on the right-hand side. So how does this connect to student loan debt? Over the same period, we see increasing racial disparities in student loan debt, both in the proportion of households that carry, as well as the percentage of household financial debt portfolios that is comprised of student loan debt. So over the period across both Black and white households, we see an increasing number of households taking on student loan debt, but we see that the rates for Blacks is higher, right? And this is, the period between the Great Recession, where you see this large uptick amongst Black, significant uptick for Black households. One could possibly argue that the previous slides are conflated by the inclusion of households with lower SES or individuals who do not graduate. So often we can talk about that too in the Q&A about non-completers. But however, when you focus on the college graduate population, we actually, has been shown pretty consistently across several different data sets that the racial wealth gap is actually the largest amongst college graduates. So here we see even through, the late 1980s to the 90s, early 2000s, we see a growth in the racial wealth gap amongst college attending populations and those who have actually completed their degrees. So scholars have expressed concern that student loan debt may be reproducing racial wealth inequalities amongst the latest generation of youth, but there are few empirical tests. They argue that racial disparities mirror, so as in the previous set of slides that I showed you, are mirroring racial inequalities in debt, and that rising student loan debt may be raising questions about this fragility of the next generation of Black middle class. So what am I talking about here? Here, I'm talking about if we define the middle class by educational attainment, the young adults who would be feeding into potentially households with secure financial security and financial stability, but also have a disproportionate amount of debt in those households as well. And we know from qualitative and in-depth interview work that the Black middle class considers their status to be very stressful, right? They see their status as being temporary, so that's why we have focused in on this idea of the fragility, like how, if they've reached it to this particular status, how secure do they feel being in that particular, in that place. So there are two potential processes through which debt or debt inequalities may be related to racial wealth inequality. The first being the causal relationship in which student debt inhibits wealth acquisition, right? So there can be some consumer behavioral aspects such as having poor credit, if you're in default or low pay, or you have low pay or higher debt, you're also spending a lot more time paying off that debt rather than accumulating assets over that period. And then there could just be a compositional processes in which the student debt drags down net wealth. So we define net wealth as value of all financial assets minus the net value of all debts, right? And so if your debt is higher than the assets, then you will have lower net wealth. So what we do here is, in order to estimate how racial disparities in debt contribute to racial disparities in wealth, we're going to use a Blinder-Oaxaca regression decomposition. So it's a linear model that's going to decompose the racial wealth gap into our model characteristics, and in particular, examine the contribution of student debt to the to the racial wealth gap, right? And so what the Oaxaca decomposition allows you to do is decompose into this explained portion, which is attributable to the racial wealth gap that is due to the composition of our observable or model characteristics. Again, thinking about those three domains in which I outlined in the first part. And then what is left unexplained is the impact of these compositional variables or the difference in these coefficients, and it's largely unmeasured aspects, oftentimes attributed in the case when you're doing a racial analysis to racial discrimination. So the results that I'm going to present here today are specific to the asset module that was collected for the NLS Y97 youth when they turned, or when they aged into the sample age 30. And so, and they include, again, the sample from our previous analysis. And what we see is that by age 30, the black-white gap in our sample is close to $64,000. With our model covariates that include the controls from our full model, we're able to explain about 53% of that gap, and about 47% is left unexplained. Student loan debt is explaining about 20% of that wealth gap, and as you see here, it's the largest contributor, followed by the young adult social roles and the post-secondary institutional characteristics. So what we find here is that compositionally, racial inequalities in student debt account for a substantial minority, as we say, of the black-white wealth gap in young adulthood. That 20% is approximately $6,900. It also allows you, doing this particular type of analysis allows you to answer the counterfactual, how would the wealth gap change if they had the same amounts of wealth? So we would expect the wealth gap to decline by $69,000 if blacks and whites in our sample held similar amounts of debt. We also find in additional analysis that when we compare the racial wealth gap at age 25 to age 30, it moved from being not significant to being significant and explaining more of their wealth gap. So it's increasing over the period. We see also that the white adults in our sample have more than double their wealth holdings, whereas the black youth averages increased by less than about $5,000. Our estimation technique lends support to the compositional process. So one might ask, let me just forget about this slide. So here we actually do that same analysis, so that decomposition analysis, where we focus specifically on those who graduated in our sample, and then amongst those who did not finish their degrees by age 30, right? So by that assets module. And here, similar to other data sets that have explored the wealth gap, we see amongst the college graduates a larger wealth gap, so close to, or $93,000, and among non-completers, it's significantly lower, but they also hold on average lower wealth. But when you can look at the contribution of student loan debt, it's pretty similar, even though the amount that the graduates are contributing is higher, right? So 32% explains 32% of the wealth gap for graduates and about 34% amongst the non-completers. So to summarize from the first part, we do find support that the racial debt disparities are large and that they are increasing if we look at our models, both in Model 1, and then we account for the inequalities across those three domains, increasing debt disparities over the study period, so approximately from early age 20 all the way into their early 30s. And the second piece, we are trying to argue that these disparities may have some long-term consequences, in particular trying to explore the relationship between debt disparities and wealth disparities, and how it might be contributing to these, to the next generation of the Black middle class, again, if it is defined as the young adults who are attending post-secondary and obtaining degrees beyond post-secondary institutions. One of the things I raised earlier in my talk was that scholars, policymakers, and stakeholders are concerned whether or not attending college is worth the risk. So oftentimes you get questions like, so are you saying college isn't worth it? Or are you arguing that Black students shouldn't go to college? The answer to both of these questions, and hopefully everyone will already know the answer to those questions, is no in this room. We believe college is absolutely worth it and remains one of the few engines or key engines of upward mobility in our society, in particular in the 21st century. It's perhaps more than necessary to have a shot at economic and social prosperity. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't produce unequal outcomes that are worthy of investigation. So here, this is kind of making my first point about how we see there's lots of data work on this showing the returns to a post-secondary degree, right? So even just having attending some college, not even necessarily having some degree compared to a high school diploma or less than a high school diploma. And this chart here disaggregates it by racial and economic status. The heavy or the bold black line is having any post-secondary schooling, and then the dotted is obtaining at least a bachelor's degree. The orange lines are for black, or the black young adults, and then for the others. So even if you do a within race comparison, blacks are still consistently making less compared to their white counterparts. But if you disaggregate, if you look across educational attainment, we still see this trend of increasing returns to education once you surpass a high school diploma. There is this interesting work that has been done using the data from the College Board that looks at the returns or the labor market returns to pursuing a bachelor's degree. And whereas, as we not surprisingly might expect, that in those early years when young adults remove themselves from the labor market to go to college, those who have stayed in the labor market consistently make more money. But this projection has those who have attained a bachelor's degree surpassing the earnings of high school degree holders around the age of 35. And this dotted line is for those who have just attained a 2-year or associate's degree, so also surpassing the earnings of those who hold just a high school diploma. So just coming back to the idea of, is it worth it? Is it worth the risk? We are consistently showing that it still is associated, if you measure worth it or the worth of a college degree by labor market returns or earnings. It is consistently showing that it's worth it. I will say that even last year I was discussing at a conference that was entitled, Is College Worth It, right? It's really fascinating and amazing that we're in a space now where we have people asking these questions about higher education. And it's no surprise to me, given the increasing diversity of who is moving into the higher education population, right? So just some things to make note of. So just some concluding thoughts. I think I'm good with time. Again, there had been some research looking at the growth in student loans among recent cohorts of young adults and showing some racial disparities in debt. We are entering this conversation to measure it amongst this more recent cohort of young adults and finding that these disparities are still existing and that they are increasing over that early and young adult part of the life course. Our work also suggests that Black youth are taking on a great deal more risk. So yes, a college degree is risky, but we also believe that it's not just associated with the unknown about what's going to happen in the labor market, but there's an additional financial risk associated with the pursuit of a college degree and may not necessarily be reaping fewer rewards. Here we look at, as an outcome, wealth, but you can look at this among numerous domains to see how they may be either delayed or not necessarily, this may not necessarily be translating into the same returns as their white counterparts. And so we just want to, again, or I just want to reiterate that in this era where we are looking for solutions, given an atmosphere of rising costs and the need for a college degree, that this, if we look to student loan debt, it may be contributing to persistent inequality and reproducing inequality amongst this latest cohort of young adults. So I'll end there and take some questions. Thank you.